Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined by my guest today, Dr. Steve Macek, to talk about free speech. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Tom. It's a real pleasure to be back on the Roundtable Perspective. I've been here a couple times before.
To get started here, maybe let's look at the big picture. What do you consider the state of free speech right now globally?
The state of free speech right now globally is not great. May 3rd was World Press Freedom Day. And on that day, lots of commentators sort of weighed in on what's happening with especially freedom of the press around the world. And what we're seeing is, even though we're in the midst of this technological revolution, right, the digital revolution that is allowing more and more people to communicate directly, horizontally with each other through social media and through their cell phones and their personal computers and so on, even though, right, the potential for a kind of global dialogue between all 6 billion of us is there, increasingly governments and also private enterprises, like social media platforms, are clamping down on freedom of expression. We're seeing in countries like Russia, wholesale attacks on the independent media. In countries like Turkey, India, Brazil, China, Saudi Arabia, everywhere free speech is kind of under attack, and that includes assaults on academic freedom, which I consider to be, that is freedom of expression of intellectuals, faculty, and students, which I consider to be integral to freedom of expression.
Before we go further, we're talking about two categories of under attack here, right?
Right.
I mean, one is what we might call censorship, right?
Right, censorship of the press.
And then the other is, sort of a delegitimation effort to...
right.
To delegitimize essentially the news sources, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think they're interrelated because it's the same, in many cases, the same political actors who are trying to carry out these attacks, right?
Yeah. Now, in some of these countries you mentioned, I'm not surprised. I've never expected China in my lifetime would have anything close to what we consider free press, but. What about some of the countries where it's sort of in decline? What are those countries?
Well, I mean, I think you can look throughout, for example, Eastern Europe. Take a country like Hungary, which immediately following the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the end of the Cold War, you saw kind of a blossoming of independent media in Hungary. Civil society organizations kind of speaking freely about, representing repressed minorities like the LGBTQ minority and others. And you saw the establishment of new universities that were sort of centers of critical thought, like the Central European University that was funded in part by money from George Soros. And since then, in recent years, this authoritarian leader, Viktor Orban, has kind of seized control, or he's been democratically elected, but he's proceeded to kind of muzzle free thought and free expression.
And how's he do that?
Well, so for one thing, I'll just give you an example. He's practiced very active repression of universities. So essentially, they stripped the Central European University of its accreditation, forcing it to leave Budapest to move to Vienna. And that's like a home to lots of world-famous critical, or had faculty that included world-famous intellectuals like Zizek and Judith Butler and others, forced them to leave. But he's also outlawed, for example, gender studies as a subject at the university, arguing that gender studies is an ideology, not a science, and therefore it has no place in any universities or any educational institutions in Hungary. They've basically outlawed the teaching of feminist theory, gender studies, gender theory in in Hungary. And the same is actually happened. Jair Bolsonaro, another sort of authoritarian, I think it's no accident that this is all happening in countries where right-wing populist politicians have taken power. In Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro has also threatened to outlaw gender studies at the university, and lots of scholars, feminist scholars, or scholars who specialize in research on gender and sexuality have actually been driven from Brazil. They've been forced to flee because they've been hounded by these right-wing trolls who have threatened their lives, who've bombarded them with death threats and so on. This is happening, I think the place where we're seeing the freedom of expression sort of diminish and erode is especially in countries that have historically been very sort of democratic, or at least had liberal democracies, where right-wing political parties have taken power. Of course, the most egregious example is probably what's happening right now in India, where this Hindu nationalist party, the BJP, has taken power, and they've also really clamped down on universities and critical scholars. They've basically banned the teaching of texts that talk about, for example, India's occupation of Kashmir, texts that talk about the mistreatment of the Muslim minority in India, critical scholars, Indian scholars who write critically about, say, superstitions in Hinduism, for example, have been murdered, and whole universities have been shut down.
It sounds like the sort of thing you hear about in Saudi Arabia, maybe,
right. And it's happening in India, which is, of course, the world's largest, represented liberal democracy.
And what form does this oppression take? I mean, how are they doing that?
Well, so in some cases, it's that they're bringing charges. So India has some laws that make it fairly easy to bring charges against people who are accused of inflaming religious tensions, right? Communalist tensions.
Right. They have a history of that being a major problem.
Right.
So
They've had
I
a history
understand
of
how they got there.
Major problem, exactly.
Yes.
But some of it is also just the army, arresting student activists or critical scholars. And just putting them in jail, and there are a number of.
Is there a mechanism for this? I mean, is there a media monitoring intelligence group?
Yeah,
that systematically removes people,
we know there is in Kashmir, right, which is a disputed part of India. People of Kashmir, some people believe it should be an independent entity. Some people believe it should be part of Pakistan. India claims it, and there is India has had a fairly significant military occupation of Kashmir for a long time. And one of the ways that they implement media censorship in Kashmir, beyond simply arresting journalists, shutting down newspapers that are publishing criticisms of the occupation or of the government, is they shut down the internet. India is the world leader in internet shutdowns, where the government simply shuts down internet service for a particular region as a way of silencing kind of social media outcry about say the government. And Kashmir is the epicenter of the internet shutdowns in India. One of the really interesting things is, of course, this is having dire effects on the local economy in Kashmir. The New York Times published an account about one doctor who was connecting with his patients using telemedicine, who had to commute out of the state of Kashmir by train 70 miles to connect to the internet, to try to answer people's emails. So that is one of the ways that India has been doing it. Of course, this is something we've seen in Egypt and other places where there has been popular protest. Governments will, as a kind of last resort, because they're dealing with an unruly civil society, will simply shut down the internet as a way of shutting down free expression.
Now, historically, free speech comes out of the Enlightenment in Western
Right.
Europe, right? And it wasn't always dependent on internet and
Right.
and even
Right.
publications, even
Right.
newspapers, right? So I'm just curious. I mean, when they shut down the internet, I'm sure that's devastating. But how ultimately how effective is that?
Well, I mean, we know from, if you look back at what was called in 2011 the Arab Spring,
Yeah.
that it isn't actually all that effective because they for example tried to shut down. I think Egypt shut down the internet in an effort to stop the visible protests that were taking place in Tahrir Square, right, in Cairo, and by the point at which they decided to shut down the internet or to block social media, people had already kind of connected in person, right, and they were already engaged in these massive occupations and ongoing protests, and so it really didn't have much effect because people had alternate means of communication. I think the concern, though, is that in places where that hasn't developed, it can have a devastating effect on, for example, debate and civil discourse, right? In particular countries.
Yeah. Well, democracy is always more problematic than people want to admit when you've got a population of 100 million or 300 million people. It's not what it was in Athens 2,500 years ago. When you knew everybody who voted.
Sure,
and you went
right.
around and
Exactly.
talked to
There's
them,
only
right?
3,000 citizens.
Yeah.
Right.
3 to 5. Yeah. If we look at the United States right now, what are the issues you see here?
Well, I mean, the sad thing is that when I say the state of the freedom of expression is dire, I'm including the United States in that assessment because, for one thing, we have continuing and ongoing attacks on the press in the U.S. Over the past summer. Independent observers recorded a record number of assaults on journalists who were covering the Black Lives Matter protests. That
Physical assaults.
Physical assaults,
Yeah.
usually by police, on journalists who were attempting to cover Black Lives Matter protests and the protests that emerged after the murder of George Floyd, and this has been going on for a long time. You could argue.
Well, I mean, I remember 1968 in
Right,
Chicago.
exactly.
Right?
So it was sort of a resurgence of what happened in
Yeah.
1968, where Daley's police just started clubbing anybody with a camera. We saw a resurgence of that. I think in the coverage of the Black Lives Matter protests over the summer, and in part egged on by some prominent national politicians. Of course, Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump made no secret of his disdain for the press. He frequently stripped members of the White House press corps of their press credentials because he didn't want to deal with them. He sort of kicked them out of his press conferences. He had very few press conferences because he didn't like the press. And then when he did, you had these remarkable moments where he just sort of argued with reporters and called them, purveyors of fake news and horrible people and so on. And, his followers picked up on this disdain. And it was reflected in this sort of record number of attacks and assaults that have taken place against journalists. On top of it,
Is that documented in any way? Are there numbers for that?
That's been documented by by civil liberties organizations who monitor these kinds of things. And I think in addition to that, you have this unprecedented push by the government to clamp down on reporters' access to information. Now, we saw this, especially early on in the Trump administration where, for example, the EPA website was purged of all sorts of information about climate change and about other issues that the Trump administration didn't want reporters reporting on. And then, the continued attempt by the U.S. government to extradite Julian Assange, founder of WikiLeaks, from Great Britain to make him stand trial on espionage charges for something like 17 counts of espionage and another count of misuse of a computer that if he were found guilty for publishing what was essentially true information that this is the information that was leaked to WikiLeaks by Chelsea Manning about the contents of diplomatic cables and also information about the U.S. occupation of Iraq.
Right. Sort of a contemporary version of the Pentagon
Right,
Papers
contemporary
scenario.
version of the Pentagon. Nobody is disputing the accuracy or the truthfulness of the information that was published on WikiLeaks, and yet they're trying to extradite Julian Assange for publishing this on charges of espionage. And if he's found guilty on these charges, now he hasn't been extradited yet, and a judge in England recently, decided not to not to decide yet about the U.S.'s extradition request. But the fact of the matter is, if he is extradited, he stands trial and he's found guilty, he could be sentenced to 175 years in jail for doing what journalists do all the time, which is publish classified information that is true and accurate.
Well, I guess the other underlying issue here is, in a democratic society, are there categories of information that shouldn't be shared?
Sure, and the U.S. Supreme Court has been very clear about what those categories of information are. So if you go back and you look at the landmark Supreme Court ruling that really established, early in the 20th century, established that government censorship is a violation of the First Amendment. It's a case called Neer versus Minnesota. And in that ruling, the Supreme Court basically said, no, you cannot, even if this person is publishing information that is false, and information that is damaging to the government, and to public officials, you cannot suppress it. You can sue him after the fact for libel. You can seek damages after the fact. But the only time you can exercise what they called prior restraint, which is their definition of censorship, is when it directly endangers national security. And the example they gave would be publishing the movements of troops during wartime, saying that the U.S. is going to invade in Normandy during World War II. That's
we're all okay with suppressing that.
We're all okay with suppressing that. We're okay with suppressing information that would directly endanger national security. But nobody is claiming that the information that was published by WikiLeaks about the U.S. occupation of Iraq was endangering national security. It wasn't. This was about.
Well, I think they made arguments to that effect, but not as literally as the Supreme Court was.
But I mean, I think short of that, the Supreme Court has allowed broad latitude for publication of all sorts of information that's embarrassing and damning to the government, like the Pentagon Papers, right? Where in that case, the Supreme Court said, even though this information, the Pentagon Papers, the secret history
for
of
people
the
who
US,
aren't familiar with that, this was during the Vietnam War era, and Ellsberg had access to information that showed that the United States had been misrepresenting some things that were going on in Vietnam.
Right.
He took them to the New York Times. The New York Times decided to print them.
Right, exactly. And then the Nixon administration sought an injunction to prevent them from publishing any more stories based on those Pentagon Papers, on that information that was leaked by Ellsberg. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, even though this is embarrassing, even though this is damning, it's certainly during wartime, and the information was leaked illegally. Ellsberg was prepared to go to jail for
He wasn't.
leaking this.
He's still an activist. I mean,
he
knew what he was doing.
He knew what he was doing, but they said, no, you still must allow publication to proceed in the interests of protecting a free press.
Now, we talk about the U.S. government suppressing
Right.
Freedom of information. The government's a lot of different things, right? We've had a
Sure.
Republican, now we got a Democrat. It's hard for me to see Biden in the same light.
Oh no, he's
as,
not. He's
as
not.
Trump.
He's not the great enemy of the free press that Donald Trump was. There's no question. But he has not relented, and his administration is still seeking the extradition of Julian Assange. Right, going back. So he hasn't dropped that.
Well, so when we say the government here, we're talking about agencies that have a common interest often of not letting information out because they think that they need to control it.
Absolutely.
And that's that's sort of a human nature function there. I know I was at a corporate setting once, and we were getting comments out of a suggestion box, and the CEO would read them at a meeting every month. And there was one that he thought maybe he shouldn't read, so he formed a committee to decide whether or not he should
read this.
And the committee met and said, no, you shouldn't read it. And they wanted to see all suggestions from that point forward to decide which ones could be read and which ones couldn't, right? So I think that I think a lot of people fall into that.
No, I mean, and I think actually private corporations do quite a lot of their own censorship, as you point out.
Of course.
The Society for Professional Journalists has actually raised the alarm about what they call censorship by public information officer, because so many corporations, so many government agencies, so many nonprofits like universities have these public information officers, and increasingly journalists who used to be able to, say, roam the halls of, Purdue University or North Central College, or go and approach, an employee at Boeing or at Pfizer, are now being told that if they have questions, they have to first go and meet with a public information officer, and many times the public information officer will insist on being in the room when an interview takes place, which has a chilling effect, obviously, on the amount of on the speech, and it's made it more difficult for journalists to do their jobs.
That's not a new tactic. It's just a more pervasive one.
It's more
now,
pervasive, and I think it's in part because of the growing strength of public relations. I know many of your students. I know my students. And they're not getting jobs with newspapers or news organizations anymore. They're getting jobs with public relations.
And they're making twice as much money.
They're making twice as much money. But one of the things they're doing is rationing the kind of information, the amount of information that journalists.
Well, that's the job,
getting.
right? I mean,
that is the job.
I tell them, it's okay to advocate for the organization. Just do it ethically. And if it can't do it ethically, then you need to step down.
Right.
I wanted to get back to one other thing before we close here.
Sure.
Part of the repression you're saying you're seeing in the United States is not governmental pressure. It's a kind of a delegitimation attack. And
so yes, there are all sorts of private entities.
I know you've got a book coming out later this year called Clickbaiting the Academy.
Absolutely,
and you talk about a kind of a somewhat coordinated effort. I think you said the DeVos family was funding some of this, right?
The DeVos family, the Koch brothers, who are very involved in fossil fuels, the Bradley Foundation, a whole sort of constellation of very, very wealthy, well-to-do, right-wing billionaires and their personal family foundations are funding websites like Campus Reform and The College Fix that monitor what academics and student activists and others connected to universities are saying on a regular basis, are saying on social media, but are also saying in their classrooms. They're actually actively encouraging students to record their professors and their classmates in class so they can grab controversial sound bites that they then publicize to try to discredit what they see as a kind of an overwhelmingly liberal or left-wing academy.
So it's a kind of ideological censorship, which I think you mentioned earlier.
It's like a kind of it's a sort of McCarthyite. I mean, so one organization that has been very active, in this effort that gets a lot of funding from right-wing billionaires and millionaires who also fund, campus reform and college fix, is Turning Point USA, which actually has a professor watch list, a list of controversial professors. I'm not making this up.
I'm sure the professors on the list consider it an honor.
They do, and in fact, when they first released the list, this was now back, I think, in 2000. I want to say 2014 or 2015. A number of faculty wrote in angry that they had been excluded. I was one.
And they got added to the list, right?
No, they didn't put us on the list. We didn't get on the list. I wrote in angrily, why did you ignore me? Lots of people wrote in.
Here's my opinions.
Here's my CV. Look.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have for our program. I want to thank Dr. Steve Macek for joining me, as long as we're still on the air,
right.
On the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. I'll see you next time.